Project L. When Riot Games first announced their next title, it seemed like such a big deal. First and foremost because it was so unprecedented. Past the initial gold rush of the 90s, when it seemed like every company wanted to get in on Street Fighter's success, the genre was basically in the hands of just a handful of developers. None of the mainstream publishers seemingly have any interest in fighting games, which is not difficult to understand, to be fair. But then suddenly Riot bucks this trend and decides to make a fighting game based on League of Legends, one of the most popular games in the world. Not only that, but they are planning to make it free-to-play, which is a monetization model that fighting games have never done properly, always limiting players in some major ways that you don't expect in other free-to-play games. Big company, large IP, free-to-play format. Just these three elements were enough for the entire FGC to go wild and start speculating about how this game will forever change the genre, and start hypothesizing about all the great things that might happen as a result of its inevitable quality and popularity. Skip a few years into the future, and while it still has some die-hard believers, it's almost became a laughingstock, a subject of jokes and mockery. How did this happen? What could this result in, and is there a chance of a comeback? That is the subject of today's video. If you end up enjoying it, we always appreciate if you subscribe or leave a like. Thank you. Quite a bit of time has passed, so let's remember how this whole thing actually started, going back to before the game was even announced. Perhaps this is obvious, but while it is technically a Riot game, it's not made by the people who did the MOBA or the first-person tactical shooter. While there are some nuances, the game is actually being made by Radiant Entertainment. If you haven't heard about them before, that's not much of a surprise. The history of this company before it became Riot's San Francisco Bay Area studio is quite short, but nonetheless important. It was founded in 2011 by Tom and Tony Cannon, who you might know as the creators of EVO and the developers behind GGPO. In 2013, they opened the Kickstarter for their very first game, Stonehearth. The game promised an interesting mix of RTS, RPG, colony sim, and a city builder, quickly raising $750,000, over 6 times more than their initial goal. The game launched in early access in the June of 2015, receiving a very positive reception with players highlighting how promising the game is. Around the same time in July, they announced that Radiant raised $4.5 million in seed funding, leading to the review of their second title, Rising Thunder, a free-to-play fighting game about giant robots. They were ahead of the time in many ways, utilizing a simplified control scheme and planning to have a free-to-play model similar to Dota 2, where all characters are free but players can spend money on various cosmetics. Less than a year after that, in March, Radiant was bought by Riot Games for an undisclosed sum. The development on Rising Thunder abruptly ended the same month, citing that the team will start working on a new game that they are incredibly excited about, which we can presume to be Project L. To their credit, Radiant would announce the open-sourced Community Edition a year later in 2017, essentially handing the game over to the fans. However, it didn't work out all that well for Stonehearth, which released from early access in 2018 without fulfilling all of the Kickstarter promises. Only after all this we get to 2019 and the first announcement of Project L. Back then all we got was some concept art in the background and a short gameplay clip. But it was more than enough to get everyone excited. It seemed like a perfect recipe for success. You have people who understand the fighting game community. People who understand how to make online feel perfect. They're given money to make a AAA fighting game based on one of the most popular IPs in gaming. And it's going to be free? That's revolutionary! What could possibly go wrong? Well, turns out quite a bit. For starters, the time itself started to plant the seeds of doubt. It is generally not a good idea to announce your game too early, because unless you can continue to show people something new and exciting, their interest will eventually dissipate, and the hype will be replaced by concerns. Some people even started suspecting that the game will never release, or making fun of the new, admittedly awful name, not like there was much else to discuss. Since the original announcement, we heard almost nothing about the game, until some years later when Riot started bringing the game's demo to various significant FGC events. People already joked that it might have more presence at EVO as a demo than it will as one of the games in the main lineup. It doesn't help that quite a few things changed since 2019. Back then, not a lot of games were coming out, rollback netcode was far from the norm, and outside of Tekken fans who were still very much enjoying Tekken 7, everyone else was either going back to the classics or trying to enjoy the disappointing Street Fighter V. These days, the fighting game fans are much better served, and almost everyone has a modern title that suits their needs. But hey, in 2021 they revealed that this would be Attack Fighter, and we haven't seen a major release in that area since 2018 with DBFZ. However, even this point evaporated once enough time has passed and competition managed to sprout out of nowhere. The chief among them being the licensed Marvel Tokon game from Arc System Works. On one hand, this is a two-cake situation. But realistically speaking, in this position people just pick whatever looks better, while competition is left to pick up the scraps, which does not bode well for 2XKO. All of this could have been overlooked if the game was so good, or at least good enough, that people really wanted to get their hands on it, regardless of how long it takes. Sadly, during the both Alpha Lab sessions, the feedback was somewhat mixed. When the original one came out, people were still getting used to the unusual and somewhat unintuitive control scheme, despite the simplicity being a selling point. The long combos have also become a major talking point. There's nothing wrong with long combos in and of themselves, but when they don't look cool and don't require much execution, it starts to become a problem. Because both players are now spending less time on active decision making and more time on executing the same sequence of inputs. They took much of the feedback to heart for Alpha Lab 2, but also swung too hard on some of the changes. One thing that pretty much everyone noted was the awful pacing, with many matches, even at high level, ending in timeouts. When you combine the game's strong keep out, fast backdashes, easy escape from Okizeme, air blocking, nerve damage, and generous grey life recovery, it leads to some incredibly boring matches. It also created some awful situations where players were more interested in quickly losing or drawing out the match just for the meter gain, because comebacks became so unlikely that going for the win was basically not possible. Some of this is already being addressed, but it exposes the biggest issue with the game, which is an apparent lack of vision for what 2XKO is supposed to be. If fundamental parts of the game can be so easily changed just based on the community feedback, what do the developers themselves actually want to create? Hell, we know that this game didn't even start out as Attack Fighter. The 2v2 version apparently has been in development for only 4 years, and they didn't actually know what the game was gonna be when it got announced. To begin with, it's very confusing that they chose to make a beginner-oriented fighting game that wants to grab a massive audience, but chose the subgenre that was always niche. Attack fighters are meant to be filthy and degenerate. It's the hardcore subgenre for sickos who are so deeply in love with fighting games that they want to engage with the most perverse aspects of this genre. The long, difficult combos, the incredibly messed up mix-ups and setups, the janky tech that spawns out of complex mechanics, the insane depth that comes from the number of possible matchups and interactions. It's typically the sort of games that you dive into and either learn to swim or drown trying. Not something that you casually pick up and play for a few matches after work now and then. It's not impossible to make a tag fighter that appeals to the broader audience, but the Venn diagram of tag fans and casual players are two separate circles, and they all have very different needs. The final nail in the coffin has been the reveal that the game will only have 10 characters on release. This is pretty much unprecedented beyond the realm of the smallest indie fighting games, and even the shorter 4-year development time does not explain why a tag fighter will have this few characters on release. You will basically see almost half of the game's roster the first time you play it, which dampened the excitement for a lot of people. It seems especially bad for a game based on League of Legends, with dozens of characters that people would love to see on the roster. With all the compounding issues, we have to wonder if this game really has any chance of success. Some might still think it is inevitable, after all League of Legends has millions of players and Riot has what it takes to promote the game. But we have to remember that this didn't work out for Legends of Runeterra. Even Riot Forge ended up getting shut down, despite most of the games releasing under it achieving decent results relative to their scale. They have a massive challenge of maintaining a solid player base with a game that has niche appeal and a tiny roster, which will take at least 2 or 3 years to reach an acceptable volume of characters. On the upside, each of those characters typically has a massive fanbase that might be convinced to give this game a try when they release. and the rare option to play this in co-op against other people might make it a lot easier for fighting game veterans to take care of their less experienced friends. Whether or not Riot themselves believe in this game and if they are willing to support it long term might become the deciding factor for 2XKO. We are curious to hear how you personally feel about this. Does 2XKO appeal to you at all, and how do you envision the potential future of this game? As always, thank you all for watching all the way to the end. See you next time.